Joining us in the Ukraine Today studio today is Serhiy Gusovsky. He is the head of the Samopomich faction in the Kiev City Council. Serhiy, thank you very much for coming in, sparing your time today. So, first question, can you just explain to us in a few words what you do?
Well, being a deputy in the City Council, if you would, I'm sort of a member of the board of the city. And I'm trying to do my best, and our faction tries to do our best to protect the interests of Kievans, so the citizens of Kiev, and to represent them in the best way in order to develop our city as a city where one can enjoy living and quit fighting for the normal life.
I understand that the current mayor, Vitali Klitschko, he is one of your main opponents, and political analysts have said that during his time, since the Euromaidan revolution, where he rose to his fame, I guess, he hasn't implemented the reforms. There's still lots of illegal buildings, and the city is not so clean. If you were to take over as mayor, what would you do differently?
Well, you're absolutely right. The key is to fight corruption. So basically speaking of reforms, one should start from corruption. And you cannot fight corruption, let's say, fighting it here and not touching it here, fighting it here and not even looking at situation here. So it's either true and open fight, or it's just blubbering about it. And so fighting corruption is the first thing. And we just recently heard a great announcement of some new activities in respect to fighting corruption, but new activities after what? It's been more than a year. In fact, today is exactly 13 months since we were elected, and there are no results, nothing that one can show in respect to this fight against corruption. Secondly, I would put all efforts in order to open everything related to the budget. The incoming money, how we spend the money as a city, it should be online, it should be available for anybody to check what's going on and how the city uses basically money as being a significant part of the assets that belongs to the Kievite. And thirdly, I would touch, let's say, a particular situation, which is transportation, public transportation, which is basically dying these days. And we see that, let's say, buses that are supposed to carry actually a vast majority of Kievites are getting, those routes are getting shrunk. And so there are a lot of activities related to, let's say, squeezing out those buses out of those parks where they're located in order to use the space that is freed up for the development of new, let's say, residential buildings or commercial offices or any other type of let's say development activities, which is also going on with not really clear rules and not really transparent methods and algorithms.
And talking about these developments that are being built around the city, if you were to maybe clamp down on these, and there were some small protests, which we've seen in the past, this is probably the reason why, for example, Vitali Klitschko hasn't really done so much, because he's well aware that the protests could erupt at any time. How would you deal with the protesters?
I guess in every situation, which it's quite predictably intense. Speaking of, let's say, relationship between the inhabitants or citizens that are living nearby the prospective development plot and the owner of that development, one would definitely require dialogue, an open and constructive dialogue. And so when people representative of both sides, let's say in this case both two sides, can sit at the table and discuss who requests what or who expects what from the other side, and in this case mayor or mayor's office is the best let's say mediator for that kind of conversation, because obviously by itself that conversation may never happen, and to facilitate the mutual understanding that, let's say, development, one cannot stop, it should not stop development and construction activity in the city, but it should also go in a way which is, supports harmony rather than brings chaos.
And this dialogue hasn't happened before? No.
Well, you bet. I mean, as much as we hear about fights and we know that streets are being blocked and stuff like that, I mean, what can be better indicator of inability of, let's say, mayor's office to conduct a constructive dialogue between the sides.
Mm-hmm. And your faction, the self-help, the Samopomich faction, is relatively new on the political scene compared to the other parties that have been here for years. So do you think that puts you at a disadvantage or an advantage?
Well, obviously there are two sides of medal in this case. Speaking of peculiarities, you know, when a year ago, 13 months ago, as I said, we got elected. I mean, we didn't have a history of a faction, so you don't really know where to go, what to do, because I mean, you're absolutely new. It's 5 deputies that we have out of 120, and there are not that many people that are, you know, showing you around. Basically, I mean, they're looking at you and thinking, okay, how are we going to do it? And but anyway, we got used to that situation fairly quick. And speaking of advantages, for sure, it's important to stress that we don't have any, you know, issues to hide. We don't have any skeletons behind us and ourselves, and so when we are talking of fighting corruption, okay, if you go after, you know, those structures or methods or schemes, you are not afraid to, you know, to actually openly fight against them, because people cannot tell you, but look, but you did also, you know, something like that, and that is the trouble that you know, you can that every, let's say, old party encounter.
And when you first started in politics, how did you know what the people wanted? Because maybe past people in office, they knew roughly what people in Kiev actually wanted, maybe improving the transport or cleaning up the streets or corruption. How did you find out what people actually want?
Well, I mean, it's not a brainer to find out, because I lived in Kiev.
So you used your personal experience.
It's
yeah.
Just, you know, myself taking care of, you know, myself and friends, and so I mean, it's easy to understand what you are supposed to do.
I wanted to touch on tourism as well. A couple of my friends who've been to Kiev, they've said that it's a great city, but it's just not promoted. How would you promote the city? What would be the top 3 things you would do to promote Kiev as a destination? Because most people from Western Europe would go to, say, Poland or Croatia, maybe other states, but not so much Ukraine.
Well, I would say Kiev should be in a position to, let's say, sort of a bridge between East and West. And I mean, if you travel to Georgia, or if you travel to Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or wherever, I mean, you can stay overnight in Kiev, or you can actually hold the conversation that the other side can fly to Kiev. So it can be sort of a middle point, for example. And so it's one of the possibilities. Another, you know, we are a country of 40 million population, and so there is quite a serious market in the country. And so I'm sure that a lot of activities can be related to that aspect. And obviously having quite long and deep history as you know, the Orthodox Church. There are many sites that are absolutely unique, like Kyiv-Pecherskaya Lavra and Sofia, that are more than 1,000 years old. And definitely, I mean, one can see mosaics that were built during the Byzantine period. And so, I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities, as well as having a Dnieper River, you know, that goes through the city. I mean, you can do all kinds of activities related also with, you know, with that part. I mean, one can do the triathlon competitions and stuff like that. And, I mean, there are many possibilities.
Serhiy, thank you very much for coming in. That was Serhiy Gusovsky. He is the head of the Samopomich faction of the Kiev City Council. Now, back to the news.